Today we're going to be talking about creating histograms, and we have to remember that a histogram is a graph of the data that groups the interval based on intervals. They're also known as bins and represent the amount of data that belongs to each interval by a bar. So the question is, when we're making a histogram, how can we decide what intervals to use to represent the data? Remember, this is showing groups of data, so we're not going to know individual data amounts, and we're only going to know the frequency that it happens, either represented by a percent or a count for the number of times. So when we're talking about calculating those intervals, the class widths for the bins of data, we want to look at the range and divide it by the square root for the number of data pieces that are represented. Remember from previously, we talked about a range being the maximum minus the minimum, and we're again divided by the square root of our data. So let's take a look at a set of data where we have the individual values so we can create a histogram to represent it. Here we want to make a histogram for the number of siblings each person had in a class. And so here we've got them arranged. They just happen to be in numeric order. They don't have to be, but it's a little bit easier to spot your minimum and maximum values. So when we start to go into those class widths to figure out the intervals that we're using for the bins of data in our graph, we're going to find the range. So our maximum value is 11. Our minimum value is 0. We count up how many data values that we have, which is 21. So when I take 11 and divide it by the square root of 21, I end up with 2.4. Now here we're going to follow our rounding rule. Because we're talking about the number of siblings that we have, we only can have integer values. So we're going to look at the decimal. If it's a 0.5 or higher, we're going to go up to 3. If it was lower than 0.5, we're going to go down to 2. Since it's 0.4, we're going to go down to 2. So when I start making my histogram, I'm going to make my independent and dependent axis. The independent is going to represent the number of siblings. The dependent is going to represent the frequency that occurred. And I'm also going to use this width to set up my scale. So I would start 0, 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, and so on to represent the data that I had in my collection. Frequency, I could count by 1s or 2s. It really depends on what I'm seeing for the number of siblings. So I think counting by 1s would be appropriate. And again, here, these are the widths. These are also known as the lower bounds for your widths, the intervals, showing you what you're starting with for your counting for that section. And then we're going to figure out the upper bounds for those items. So again, since we're counting by 2s, this first bin here is going to count all the people with 0 or 1 siblings. The next one is going to count all the people with 2 to 3 siblings, and so on and so forth. You can still see the class width here with those upper bounds for your intervals because we still have that same spacing of 2 that we did for your lower bounds. So here I'm just going to start counting how many fit each interval, each bin of data. You might see it represented by tick marks. You might just see a value to represent it. And then we can start creating our bars. So we've got 9 people with 0 to 1 siblings, 8 people with 2 and 3 siblings. We got 3 people with 4 and 5 siblings, and we have 1 person with 10 or 11 siblings. So what we're going to do now is start making those bars for each interval or each width that we have. So the first one has 9 from 0 to 1, or 0 and 1. So from 0 and 1s, that's this section here. I can put my pencil up, draw in my bar. That's my first bin for my graph. Then I'm going to do the same thing for the next one. 2 and 3 siblings, that's this section here. I have 8, bring up my pencil, draw down my bar. Then I'm going to go to my next one for 4 and 5 siblings. I have 3, bring it up, carry down, make your bar. Last but not least, I've got 1 with 10 or 11 siblings. I go to that section for 10, 11, draw my bar, and I have it represented. You can have different colors for each one. Sometimes they color them in, sometimes they use different shading, but we can always know the frequency for each time for that number of siblings to happen by looking at the heights of the bars. So if we were ever given a histogram and they said, well, how many pieces of data, how many people did we ask, we could add all the heights, and that should match what we had here for the number of pieces of data. So that was a quick rundown of how to make your histograms, and we'll build off of that in our next class.